Hello, welcome back to our second lecture in the series, What is Talmud? I am Michal Barashel Sigal. I'm a professor of Talmud at the Department of Jewish Thought at Ben Gurion University in the south of Israel. And I organized this lecture series with this in mind. I wanted to introduce the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, to a wide audience of people that not necessarily know what the Talmud is or what it's about, but at the same time, I wish to introduce to our listeners, to our audience, the Talmud, the newest development in the study of the Talmud. So not just introduce a very basic introduction to the Talmud, but in fact, offer you the newest views about the Talmud, the newest question in research, new avenues, new methods that allow us scholars to look at the Talmud from new and interesting and intriguing ways. Our first lecture dealt with the composition of this text. You are welcome. It was recorded and it's found, Professor Muli Vidas from Princeton University, and you're more than welcome to hear the recording of that lecture that's found on the website of the National Library of Israel. And today is our second lecture, and I am especially honored to introduce today's speaker, Professor Christine Hayes from Yale University. I'll tell you why I'm especially excited, because Professor Hayes was my dissertation advisor a few years back. But Professor Hayes is, as I said, a professor of Talmud in Yale University in the Department of Religious Studies. She was actually recently been given the highest faculty honor given to 40 professor, which is the Yale Sterling Professor of Religious Studies at Yale. She deals with the literature and the history of the biblical and the Talmudic text. And I actually want to plug in. She has an incredible course of Introduction to Talmud that's online at Yale, and you're very welcome to look it up. It's free and available online, an introduction to the Bible. She has written a few monographs, award-winning monographs about impurity and about the connection between the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. And her most recent book, which is connected to today's talk, is called What's Divine About Divine Law? And I invited her today to speak about our second topic in the series, which is the content, the law that the Talmud deals with, and how is it related to biblical law, and how is rabbinic law different from other laws, and how it relates to the divine. So without further ado, I'm letting Chris begin her talk. And what I want to invite you to do is, while Professor Hayes give her talk, to put any question you have in the chat. I'll collect them and try to incorporate them in the second part of this conversation that will introduce question Professor Hayes in a more conversation fashion. Chris, I'm giving you the floor.
Thank you so much. I just want to do a sound check to make sure that I have a thumbs up with the sound.
Lovely.
Good. So thank you so much, both to Tadeusz and also to Professor Barsher Siegel. I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of this wonderful series. And as you all know, the Babylonian Talmud is an enormous collection of the teachings and traditions of rabbis from the 1st to the 7th centuries, living in both the land of Israel and in Babylonia. And while the Talmud contains narratives and legends and biblical interpretation, it is especially famous for its extremely complex and lengthy discussions and debates over matters of divine law. And it's the Talmud's view of divine law that's going to be our topic for today. I'd like to show you how the rabbis in the pages of the Talmud developed a conception of divine law that resisted and rejected the Hellenistic or the Greek ideas of divine law that were prevalent in the surrounding culture. And this rabbinic view of divine law was radical and countercultural in its day, and it may even be radical and countercultural still in our own day. Now, I'm going to divide my talk into 3 parts. I'll be using a PowerPoint, and so I'm sharing my screen now, and I will divide my talk into 3 parts. First, I'm going to call these 3 parts the what, the why, and the how. So I'll first show you what the rabbinic idea of divine law is. And to do that, we'll also have to consider what it isn't. We'll have to ask, what was the view of divine law in the rabbis' broader environment, the view that they resisted and rejected? And once we understand what the rabbinic conception of divine law was, then we'll ask why. Why did the rabbis insist on this countercultural view? And finally, we'll ask exactly how is this view of divine law reinforced on nearly every page of the Talmud. So first, for the what was the conception of divine law that the rabbis rejected? Well, it was the conception of divine law that emerged from the Greek philosophical tradition. And here I'm going to focus on the Stoics because it was a popular version of their view that would pervade the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean. So what was that view? Well, in ancient times, people tended to think of nature as disordered and chaotic, a kind of dog-eat-dog world of competing powers. But certain Greek philosophers began to argue that nature is not chaotic, but ordered by a kind of natural law that's inherent in it. The Stoics, who believed that God was nature and nature was divine, were the first to use the term divine law, theos nomos, to refer to this natural law. So according to the Stoics, the divine natural law governing the cosmos was reason itself, or logos, they called it, which is just the word for reason. And reason, they argued, is universal, right? What's rational here is rational in Iceland. And it is also true, always true, and unchanging or immutable, static in its perfection. The Stoics and Greek philosophy generally distinguished divine law from human positive law, meaning the written legislation and rules of political states that are grounded in the will of a sovereign authority. The positive laws of states are not universal, they're particular to a given city or state, and they're not necessarily rational or true. I don't stop at a red light because stopping at redness is a universal rational truth, but because we arbitrarily picked red to be the color we would agree we would stop at. Positive human laws are historically conditioned. They're contingent. They vary from place to place and from time to time, changing in response to the ever-evolving circumstances of life. They're not immutable. And another difference, the positive laws of states are formulated in words and sentences and may even be written down. The divine natural law is unwritten because it's just reason itself. So according to this Greek philosophical tradition that would permeate the regions conquered by Alexander the Great, including the land of Israel, divine law is an unwritten logos or reason embedded in nature that is universal, true, and unchanging, and unwritten. By contrast, in the biblical tradition, there's no real distinction between divine law and the positive laws of the community, because the divine law delivered at Sinai is the positive law for the ancient Israelite community. It's not an unwritten rational order in nature, but a body of written legislation expressing the divine lawgiver's will for one particular people, Israel. It contains both rational and non-rational commandments. Some laws of the Torah are rational, surely, but some, such as the dietary prohibitions and purity taboos, are not. In fact, it's precisely because they are not universally recognized rational truths observed by all peoples that they can serve so well to distinguish Israel from other nations as God's covenant partner. These laws are also not static, and they are unchanged and not unchanging. I'm sorry, these laws are not static and unchanging, but they are dynamic and responsive. Already in Moses's own day, some laws are said to be updated, supplemented, or modified to meet new historical contingencies. 3 times Moses has to go to God and ask what the law should be for a case where there hasn't been any clear answer. And on a 4th occasion, the daughters of Zelophehad argue in the book of Numbers that they should be allowed to inherit their dead father. And God says, you know, you're right. We really should change things so that daughters inherit when there are no sons. Moses, make a note of that. We're changing things. New situation, new rules. Deuteronomy 17 describes the process by which the law can be applied to new situations long after the death of Moses. So it should be immediately apparent by looking at this chart on your screen that there's a severe mismatch or contradiction between the Greek and the biblical conceptions of divine law. The divine law of biblical tradition possesses most of the features that Hellenistic thought attributed to human law, the items highlighted in blue. Ancient Jews could not help but be aware of this mismatch, and some of them found it very distressing. Those who admired Hellenistic culture and admired its conception of divine law were eager to prove that the divine law of biblical tradition, their own heritage, met the Hellenistic definition of divine law. And so against the evidence of the biblical text, they claimed that the law given to Moses was divine according to the standards of the Hellenistic culture that they so admired and emulated, which means it had the characteristics on this side of the chart. It was rational and universal and true and immutable. We see this in the letter of Aristeas. This is a work written by a Jewish author in the 2nd century BCE. And in this work, philosophers ask the Jewish protagonist how a divine law could include dietary and purity laws that contradict reason and nature. And the Jewish figure responds that the legislation was not laid down at random, but with a view to truth and as a token of right reason, orthos logos. The dietary laws and the purity laws, which appear unnatural and irrational, are, he says, allegories for rational truths that lead to virtue. But it's the 1st century Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria who goes the farthest in repackaging the law of Moses as the Stoic natural law. He declares that the divine laws delivered at Sinai through Moses attain to the harmony of the universe and are in agreement with the principles of eternal nature, and that the laws and statutes are but the sacred words of nature. He maintains that the Torah is not particular but universal, and someday each nation will abandon its particular ways and turn to honoring our laws alone. He asserts that the laws of Moses are immovable and unchanging like nature itself, and most surprisingly, that the Torah is actually unwritten. The written text we possess is just a copy of the true Torah, which is the unwritten law of nature. These are very strong and surprising claims. But not all Jews were distressed by the contradiction between the Hellenistic conception of divine law and the biblical representation of divine law. The rabbis who flourished from the late 1st to the 7th century in both Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, and then Babylonia, Bavel, they were also aware of this contradiction, and they were, generally speaking, unapologetic. There are some exceptions, but this is definitely the majority position. They, by and large, resisted applying the Hellenistic definition of divine law, universal, immutable, true reason, to the Torah given at Sinai. So, against prevailing Hellenistic conceptions of divine law, the great majority of the rabbis doubled down on the biblical conception of divine law as a written body of legislation, a written body of legislation for a particular community, grounded in the will of a sovereign divine being, containing both rational and non-rational commandments, and by no means a single abstract, unchanging rational truth. And they did this through legal rulings and stories in which the Torah is shown to be, first of all, is shown to deviate from reason and truth, and secondly, to require modification, updating, or revision on occasion. For example, on literally hundreds of occasions, the rabbis will assert that some laws of the Torah are contrary to reason and cannot be derived through logic. The rabbis will say, badin, meaning according to logic, the law, the halakha, should be X, but the divine Torah says it's Y. What can we do? We must obey the Torah even though it defies logic and reason, because it's the will of God. Literally hundreds of times they do this. On other occasions, the rabbis will determine the law in defiance of empirical facts, tolerating legal fictions and contrary to fact rulings, if doing so will achieve humane and compassionate goals. In one passage in the Talmud, women are presumed to be in a state of ritual purity when their husbands return from a journey, even though this will not always be factually true, but the facts are less important than promoting marital intimacy and procreation. Similarly, when applying the law in judgment, the rabbis hold that a pious judge will balance justice with other important values like compassion or modesty or peace or humility or charity, and these might override strict truth. Neither do the laws of the divine Torah necessarily align with the facts of the natural world. In one famous case, the rabbis established the calendar in defiance of astronomical reality. As for modification of the law, the rabbis resist the prevailing conception of divine law as static and unchanging. The Talmud contains a number of rulings that adjust the divine law for the sake of the social order or the public welfare. In many instances, humans are God's essential partner in the project of Torah. They critique the law and improve it based on their human experience. So I've talked now about what the rabbis did. In the pages of the Talmud and across the rabbinic corpus, the rabbis reasserted the biblical view of divine law. The divine law is not a static, fixed, immutable truth. It's a body of written legislation grounded in the will of the divine sovereign, regulating the life of a particular and concrete human community and responsive to the ever-shifting circumstances of life in an ever-changing world. This is not the view of divine law that prevailed in the broader Hellenistic culture. It was a truly countercultural position. So let's take a minute then to talk about why they did this before we look more closely at precisely how they did it. The rabbis' view of divine law is connected to their view of the divine being. The God of biblical and rabbinic tradition is not the philosopher's impersonal and unchanging first principle or the fixed and static order embedded in nature. The God of biblical and rabbinic tradition is a living, dynamic presence, intimately involved in the unfolding and unpredictable human story, responsive to human actions and needs, a God encountered in the concrete and dynamic realm of history. At Sinai, God did not give the Israelites a lesson in abstract rational philosophy. God did not give a fixed and immutable natural law. God gave detailed legislation for the ordering of a concrete human community. Now, if God is a dynamic and responsive living presence, then God's law, they figured, must also be dynamic and responsive to the challenges of living in a constantly changing world. As we noted, the dynamism of the law is seen already in the Bible when God has to fill gaps in the law and changes the law of inheritance for daughters, for example, and when God establishes procedures for determining what the law will be in new, unanticipated cases. The Torah can only meet the challenges of life in human community if it is dynamic and responsive, and that is the reason that the rabbis resist the Greek conception of divine law as some fixed, rational truth. If the Torah is to meet the complex and shifting needs of human life, it must be endlessly generative, open to new developments, adjustments, and even repair. Again, this is why the rabbis refuse to attribute to the divine Torah the qualities that the Greeks attributed to divine law: absolute fixity, a single immutable truth, because they are suspicious of dogmatic claims of absolute certainty. They are suspicious of final answers. They are aware of the dangers of a rigid absolutism for meeting the needs of a dynamic human community. And so on nearly every page of the Talmud, we see a resistance to the idea that the divine law given to Israel at Sinai was a static, fixed, immutable truth. On nearly every page of the Talmud, we find a demonstration of the idea that the Torah is dynamic and responsive to the ever-changing circumstances of life. But how precisely is the divine law's dynamism demonstrated on the pages of the Talmud? Well, to answer this question, I suggest that we think of the Talmud as a kind of play that cautions us against becoming too certain of ourselves. Play refers to a structured activity with an undetermined outcome that avoids coming to a final conclusion, a dynamic activity that generates provisional meanings rather than unveiling one absolute truth or absolute truths. One technique for avoiding a determinative conclusion is the endless multiplication of detail. Here's what Moses Mendelssohn, an 18th century Jewish thinker, had to say about detail. He said, "Take any proposition you please and talk, write, or argue about it, for or against it, often and long enough, and you can be sure that it will continue to lose more and more of whatever clearness it may once have possessed. Too much detail obstructs the view of the whole." Talmudic argumentation can be seen as a kind of play that employs an ever-increasing level of detail in a concerted effort to defer final answers and to keep the game going so that it doesn't freeze in a dogmatic rigidity. And it is the anonymous voice of the Talmud, or the stam, that runs this game. Like the ringmaster at a circus, the Stam seems to summon sages across 2 lands and 4 centuries to perform a variety of actions. They speak, they object, they respond to objections, they draw inferences, they register agreement or disagreement. The Stam will introduce them with phrases like, "And haven't we learned the following?" Or, "What would Rabbi so-and-so say?" Or, "According to the one who holds this view, wouldn't this action be permitted?" And in the process, the Stam adds complexity and hypothetical conditions and detail upon detail to keep the game going. To demonstrate this claim, I'm going to take you through 2 examples, one patently funny and the other entirely serious. And if your head spins, that's okay, because it will just prove my final point. So let me describe one Talmudic discussion. In this discussion, a certain rabbi says that a sukkah, the ceremonial hut that's constructed for the observance of Sukkot, the festival, a sukkah may be constructed using an animal for one of its 3 required walls. Now, another sage, Rabbi Meir, prohibits this. Why does he prohibit this? 2 sages living 2 centuries later and hundreds of miles away suggest reasons. One says Rabbi Meir fears the animal will run away, and there goes your wall. But another says Rabbi Meir fears it might die, and there goes your wall. The anonymous voice of the Talmud, the Stam, puts these teachings into play and orchestrates the entire discussion that follows. The Stam begins by asking, well, what difference it makes to explain Rabbi Meir's prohibition as due to a fear the elephant will run away, or due to a fear that the elephant will die. Would these different rationales for Rabbi Meir's prohibition lead to different rulings in a particular case? And if so, what case? What difference does it make? And now the game is afoot. The Stam responds to its own question by suggesting that knowing the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition would make a difference in the case of a sukkah that has an elephant tied to something stable as one of its walls. If Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will wander off, well, this animal is tied. So Rabbi Meir would presumably not prohibit this animal walled sukkah. But if Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls because he fears the animal will die, well, this elephant might die even though it's tied. So Rabbi Meir would prohibit this sukkah. But the Stam isn't done. Perhaps Rabbi Meir's fear of the animal dying wouldn't apply in the case of an elephant, because an elephant is so large that even when dead, its carcass would still meet the minimum height required for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So maybe Rabbi Meir would permit the case of a tied elephant, whether the reason for his prohibition is fear the animal will run away or fear the animal will die. If knowing the reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition makes no practical difference in the case of a tied up elephant wall, perhaps it makes a difference then in the case of a non-elephant quadruped like a cow. A cow is smaller, and if it dies, its carcass will not reach the minimum height required for a wall to be a valid sukkah wall. So Rabbi Meir's prohibition is based, if Rabbi Meir's prohibition is based on the fear that the animal will die and fall below the minimum height, he would not permit this cow sukkah. But if his prohibition is based on a fear the animal will run away, this animal, if tied, will not run away. So he would permit this sukkah. Well, not so fast, the Stam says. What if the owner suspends the cow from the ceiling? Then if it dies, it will not crumple to the ground. It will meet the minimum height required of a valid wall. So even according to the view that Rabbi Meir prohibits animal walls for fear that the animal will die and be too short, maybe he would permit this sukkah because the suspended dead cow will be tall enough. Well, that's possible, the Stam continues, but if the owner suspends the dead cow, then there will be spaces between its legs, and a wall isn't a wall if it has large gaps. So Rabbi Meir would prohibit the suspended dead cow wall. Well, the Stam notes the owner could stuff the spaces with palm and bay branches. True, the Stam responds to itself, but carcasses tend to shrink. What if this dead cow's suspended carcass shrinks enough to create a gap between the animal wall and the ceiling? Now, we generally say a gap of up to 4 handbreadths doesn't disqualify a wall, and maybe the owner took shrinkage into account, suspending the cow close enough that even with shrinkage, the gap will be less than 4 handbreadths. Well, that's possible, the Stam responds, but what if the owner, in good faith, miscalculated the amount of shrinkage of a cow carcass? And perhaps Rabbi Meir's prohibition of an animal-walled sukkah was designed for and applies only to this specific bizarre case. Perhaps in every other case, he would actually permit an animal-walled sukkah. Now, this discussion evinces a spirit of play, not just because of the humorous subject matter, but because of certain formal features we see in so many Talmudic discussions. The endless what-ifs that propose limiting Rabbi Meir's prohibition to certain increasingly detailed and specific situations. And this kind of limitation, what if we had this case or that case? This kind of limitation is called an okimta. What if his prohibition was limited to a certain kind of animal in a certain situation? What if the animal runs away or dies or shrinks or is suspended or has gaps between its legs, and on and on? And the game continues because, as is true of any game, the real fun, the real purpose is in the playing. Although the Talmud stops the discussion where it stops, there's no genuine sense of closure. In fact, we don't find out which reason for Rabbi Meir's prohibition is correct. And there's nothing to prevent us from coming up with yet another contingent detail. The debate is potentially endless because new particulars and contingencies are always possible. Notice how the detailed objections, the hypothetical limitations or okimtas, reshape what we thought we knew. We thought that all animal-walled sukkahs were categorically prohibited by Rabbi Meir and categorically permitted by his colleague Rabbi Yehuda. But it turns out that that may not be so. And suddenly we're a little less certain of ourselves. The Talmud doesn't press to determine which view of Rabbi Meir's reason is right, exactly which sukkahs he would prohibit. It's interested only in which views are possible. Now, you might say, this discussion is a parody. Surely serious Talmudic discussions of the law are serious attempts to reach certain knowledge, a single truth, a final conclusion. So let me make my case with an entirely sober, serious example, also typical of literally hundreds of Talmudic discussions. There's a passage in one tractate in the Talmud, a tractate called Bava Metzia, that discusses the legal acquisition of something that enters one's courtyard. Now, our ringmaster, the Stam, asks whether a minor girl legally acquires objects by means of her courtyard as an adult does, right? If you want someone to acquire something, you can place it or throw it into their courtyard. The courtyard affects acquisition for them. But does it do so for a minor girl? The 3rd century Rabbi Reish Lakish says, a minor girl does not acquire objects by means of her courtyard. And his colleague, Rabbi Yochanan, says she does. So these seem to be clear, categorically certain positions. One prohibits and one permits. To explain their disagreement, the Stam suggests that they must have different ideas of how a courtyard acquires. Perhaps Rabbi Yochanan thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition in a physical sense. It holds an object like a hand. Since a minor girl can acquire things by taking and holding them in her hand, he thinks she can acquire things with her courtyard because it is like her hand. It physically holds or contains something. Perhaps Reish Lakish thinks that a courtyard affects acquisition also like my hand, but in a more metaphorical sense. Maybe he thinks that my hand acquires things for me because it's like an agent that I commission to act on my behalf. And if a courtyard acquires objects for me like my hand, it's because the courtyard is acting like an agent commissioned to act on my behalf. Since a minor cannot appoint an agent, Reish Lakish holds that a minor girl cannot acquire with her courtyard. A lengthy discussion ensues, questioning whether a courtyard is like a hand in a physical sense, or is it like a hand in a more metaphorical sense. Biblical verses are cited. Teachings by sages from different periods and from Eretz Israel and from Bavel are adduced. The Stam poses objections, responds to its own objections, and poses more objections, defending first one view and then the other, until it appears that Rabbi Yochanan will be the winner and the game is over. But the Talmud isn't interested in declaring a winner or ending the game with a single final answer. And so the passage makes a sudden 180-degree turn. 3 limitations, or okimtas, are proposed that completely redefine the original dispute. The first of our 3 proposed okimtas suggests that the original disagreement may have been limited just to the case of a found object, but in every other case, the 2 sages actually agree that the girl's courtyard acquires things for her. The second okimta suggests that maybe the original disagreement was limited to a different case, the case of a minor boy. A third Okimta then combines the two previous Okimtas and says, perhaps there was no disagreement at all. Perhaps Reish Lakish's prohibition of acquisition by a courtyard referred to a minor boy whose courtyard does not acquire a found object, and Rabbi Yochanan's permission of acquisition by a courtyard referred to a minor girl whose courtyard does acquire a divorce document for her. And poof, the dispute, which was enough to generate nearly 3 pages of detailed argumentation and a slew of ever more precise and detailed limitations, simply vanishes like magic. We thought that Rabbi Yochanan permitted a minor girl to acquire by her courtyard, and Reish Lakish prohibited the same. But it turns out that what we thought was so at the beginning is not necessarily so at the end, and perhaps with a few more Okimtos, things would look different all over again. And I emphasized, this is an entirely serious legal discussion. There are no bound elephants or cows with branches filling the gaps between their legs, and yet it is play. Most scholars assume that the Talmud's excessive argumentation and endless piling up of detailed distinctions is driven by a desire to achieve certainty, to uncover a single truth. But I disagree. I believe it's designed to bring less certainty because, as I've argued, the rabbis believed God and God's law were dynamic and responsive to the details of human existence that arise anew each day. The Talmud's style of argumentation reflects that belief. The ancient Greeks saw a preoccupation with detail as an impediment to the acquisition of true and certain knowledge. Aristotle said that if you want to know what a horse is, you have to ignore the particular details of particular horses. Their different colors and sizes and speeds and degrees of strength, and whether this one has a bushy tail or a thin tail or crooked teeth or straight teeth. Those aren't important. You have to abstract from these particulars the ideal form or essence of horseness that is shared by and defines them all. If you get bogged down in the concrete material details, you'll never see the abstract unity that transcends the diversity of material forms, and you'll never have certain knowledge of what a horse is. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps keeping our focus on the details is the Talmud's way of reminding us that when it comes to the divine law, certainty is a dangerous illusion. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Joseph Soloveitchik, is sensitive to the contrast between the Greek philosophers' preference for locating the divine in an unchanging transcendent realm or in the abstract and fixed rational order of nature, and the rabbi's conviction that the divine is to be found in the particular details of concrete material existence. In his book, Halachic Man, he writes, the common denominator of both the Platonic and Aristotelian views, or the Greek views, is that the random and particular are not deemed worthy of being granted the status of the real and existent, and remain in the realm of chaos and the void. He contrasts this with the approach of the rabbinic halakha. He says halakha has a fixed relationship to the whole of reality in all of its fine and detailed particulars. Soloveitchik goes on to point to Talmudic passages that describe God as convening a heavenly academy to grapple with halachic problems that are bound up with the empirical world. The red cow, which is a ritual for corpse impurity. The heifer, whose neck is to be broken in the case of an unsolved murder. Leprosy rules and similar issues. God and the heavenly academy do not concern themselves with transcendence, with questions that are above space and time, but with the problems and earthly life in all its details and particulars. And we might add, in all its contingency. The multiplication of details of one okimta or limiting case after another introduces into the divine law an element of uncertainty and contingency. The answers are contingent on the details, dependent on the particular circumstances, which means that when applying the law in any new situation, you can't be lazy and whip out a fixed preset answer. You have to roll up your sleeves, pay attention to the details, and figure out all over again what justice and equity look like in this case. So I've argued that Talmudic argumentation can be seen as a kind of play that employs an ever-increasing level of detail and what-ifs in a concerted effort to defer final answers and to keep the game going so that it doesn't freeze in a dogmatic rigidity. The Babylonian Talmud's famously convoluted legal discussions remind us that the Jewish God is not the static, unmoved mover of the philosophers, but a dynamic living presence, that this God's divine law is likewise dynamic, always in process, that no interpretation of the law is absolutely final, that every answer is provisional, because there's always the possibility of a new circumstance, an unanticipated detail that might demand revision, that no position, however well argued and supported, is completely immune to further thought and inquiry, that everything is always, always in play. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this wonderful, wonderful lecture and performative. And we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I hope we'll get through most of them. But before we start, I want to ask you about, you described really, it really ties in beautifully with our first lecture. You described the work of the Talmud, or the meaning of what it does in the text, as kind of a performance, right? A play, keeping everything, all the balls in the air, and really using the details not to reach a conclusion, but exactly the opposite, right? To keep us thinking, right? To keep us beautiful description of that. But what do we do with the cases when there's actual conclusion in the Talmud? Because we have sugiyot, we have passages in which we have a tiyuvta, right? We have, sometimes the Talmud does give us an answer. So what do we do with that, right? So how does it work with your keeping all the balls in the air?
Yeah. So it's a great question. We do have some discussions, arguments, where someone will introduce something and then it will be said that it's a tiyufta, which often gets translated as a refutation. The idea being not only that it's a refutation, but a final refutation. That's how people read it, as if now there can be no going back. And that's actually not true. If you look up the arguments that seem to end with a tiyufta, they very often don't end. Someone will present an argument and someone will give something that, and it's declared that it's a tiyufta. And then the stam will say, yeah, but really? And they continue. So I think that we have to take a lesson from that. That tiyufta simply means tshuva, an answer, but it doesn't necessarily mean a final answer or that the conversation is done. And there still may be another way to continue, as often happens in many cases that feature a tiyufta. So I think that even in those cases where the stam doesn't pick up and continue, I think we need to understand that it's a tiyufta in the sense that this has been answered for now, but that doesn't mean it has been finally answered. And the conversation can continue, as it so often does in many cases of tiyufta.
So basically what you're saying is the composition of the text has multiple levels, and it really ties into, really, I'm trying to connect it to our conversation in general, both the composition of the text in the first lecture, and I'm already plugging in our next talk, which will be with Professor Shai Sekunda in 2 weeks from today, when we'll talk about the Talmud in its non-Jewish context. And this is where I'm leading you to our next question. And we had a few questions from the audience talking about dating. Really, you suggest connection to Greco-Roman ideas and Greek philosophy. And we had a few questions asking, for example, Shulamite Magnus asked, isn't it more relevant to compare ancient Mesopotamians or contemporaneous Roman law rather than Greek philosophy? And I'm looking at Meshulam Gottlieb's question that asked about if the details work is being done by the Stama far away in time from the Greek and influenced notion of divine law, how can we talk about this as the background for what we see in the Talmud? So if you can expand a little bit more on the dating and how you see the non-Jewish background to what you just presented.
Sure. So we do not have from Mesopotamia a notion of natural law. The view of natural law that has been bequeathed to the West really comes from the Greek philosophical tradition, and especially the Stoics. It's picked up by Cicero, who really gives us our definition of the Stoic divine law, since we don't really have the writings of too many Stoics, but we have Cicero, who tells us about the Stoic position and defines it. And this view of divine law as something that is a logos or reason that permeates nature, is a governing power within nature, and is universal, rational, immutable, and true. This spreads throughout the Mediterranean world and is carried into the East, right? and it becomes a defining at all levels of society. We find this in rhetorical handbooks. We find this even reflected in epitaphs on tombs, the way people talk about the divine law. It's from high to low. And I would say it continues to this very day. If you ask someone, and I know because I do this every year when I teach my course on divine law, I ask my undergraduates, if someone told you that there was this divine law, what do you think it would be like? What would it be? And the students will say, well, I mean, it would have to be perfect and unchanging, and it would have to apply to everyone everywhere, and it would, make sense, right? I mean, a divine law is not going to tell you that it's good to stand on your head 24 hours a day, right? It would have to be rational. And I put on the board, and they give me the Stoic definition of divine law, which has become such a part of Western culture through Christianity, right? So this is the idea. It enters paideia, from Greek paideia, or education, and enters Christian thought and theology. We see it already in the New Testament. We already see the distinction between the divine law and human law in the New Testament when Jesus says to the Pharisees, you are abandoning divine law to pursue just your human laws, right? This permeates, becomes part of the conversation, becomes part of rabbinic self-consciousness, both in the land of Israel and in Babel. It doesn't matter that in Babel, this is carried everywhere. And as I say, I think the rabbis are doing this countercultural, radical resistance work of saying, don't judge our biblical tradition of divine law by these standards. That's not how we understand the divine being as some transcendent principle who's, operates and met in nature. It's not how we understand the divine being. It's not how we understand this divine being's attempt to regulate the moral norms of society.
So you know what? I'll take you one step further and then ask you, how do we move from this play, all the balls in the air and this performance, to a code of law, as the Talmud becomes a code of law? What's the process in which you see, if the text is not written, and I think you're absolutely right, it's not written as a code of law, but we see that we have right after its redaction attempts to make it into a code of law. Yeah. But what allows it to become a praxis, right?
So in a way, what you really need is another series after What is Talmud, and a series that is, what did the Talmud become? Because the afterlife of the Talmud is a whole story on its own, just like the afterlife of the Bible is a story on its own, right? When we think about the writings that went into the Bible, what they might have been or meant to those persons who developed those traditions is one thing. What they became when they were all collected and presented as if they were one self-consistent book, what they became is something different. In the same way, we can think about the Talmud as having a reception history, and that reception history is very much influenced by the intellectual currents of later times. So in the post-Talmudic period, we have the domestication of Hellenistic thought by the other monotheistic religions of the day, Christianity especially, but also Islam. Jews are living in Islamic and in Christian lands. And it soon becomes important to some Jews to reconcile their tradition with the canons of Greek thought, which are now seen to be universal and rational. They're divorced from a foreign culture. They're understood now to be universal human canons of reason. And so there's a desire by certain Jewish philosophers, Maimonides chief among them, to show that in fact the tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Bible, but also the rabbis, the Talmud, that all of this is consistent with the highest reason, and that to some extent reason is divine. And it's this faith in reason as being in complete accord with revelation, which tells the story of so much of the medieval period. And some Jewish thinkers will go down that path, and they will begin to apologize for some aspects of both biblical tradition and the Talmud that seem to push against that seem to allow for multiple interpretations, or that seem to valorize dispute. This becomes more uncomfortable to them. And they start to become apologetic and assert that there is, in fact, certainty or finality or one final voice behind the diversity of opinion, or the diversity of opinion is a product of our human failings, but that in fact there is one truth. If we were wise enough, we would see it. instead of celebrating the diversity and the dispute and feeling that uncertainty is in fact possibility, which is the view of the Talmud. I often think sometimes it's really just a question of choosing the right words. Some people say that all of this leads to uncertainty. And I want to say, well, just change the word uncertainty to possibility. And suddenly you change from a negative to a positive, right? All of this means there's possibility. There's work to be done. There's an invitation to us to do that work. And I think that's what the Talmud is trying to perform for us.
You know, that leads me to a very similar topic. So you're not saying, are you saying that there's no truth according to the rabbis? Is everything relative?
Right. So this is a real mistake that I think is so often made, that people think that the refusal to sort of absolutize any one position or value is just as if there are no truths and no positions, a kind of nihilism, or that it's all relative, just subjectively what I want or what I like, or it's political, right? It's relativist of today I want this, so I'll use that, and today I want that. That I don't think is what the rabbis are saying. The rabbi's position is not a value-less position. It is a value-rich position. The rabbis praise many virtues, many values. Truth is one of them. And they will even hierarchize them on occasion. This is more important than that. If you have a choice between these two things, you should go for that. Honoring human life, for example, or human dignity is more important than this particular ritual law, for example, or saving a human life is more important than faithfully observing the Sabbath, right? We know this, that they talk about values and they talk about positions, and they will say some trump others and some are more important than others. But even though they will engage in those debates and hierarchize those values and positions, they refuse to install any one as permanently and absolutely supreme, because that would be idolatry. That would be saying something is sacred and untouchable, and only God is sacred and untouchable. So they refuse to install any one position or truth or value as absolutely permanently supreme. They recognize that every moment of moral judgment requires the dynamic activation and weighing and balancing of these strongly held values and positions to determine the morally best course of action now in any given moment. And the moral reasoning that we engage in, which is really what the Talmud is doing in its argumentation, is doing moral reasoning. Moral reasoning doesn't prove that something is immutably true. It argues that something is situationally good today, and maybe often, and maybe for a long time, and maybe for 99.9% of cases, but not absolutely and immutably, because the circumstances of life are ever shifting. And wouldn't a truly divine law, one that you can rely on now and in the future, have to be dynamic and responsive rather than absolute and immutable, right? Wouldn't it have to be open to revision and critique as the circumstances require?
Wow, that was beautiful. I want to refer you to a few people asked about this, and I'll quote Arnold de Vries, that wanted to know, when you're talking about the stum, what do you mean? So this actually ties in beautifully with actually our conversation last week. But as I offered last week, really, I brought myself into hot waters by doing this series, right? Because I chose specific speakers that are really bringing you to the fore, the front line, the cutting edge ideas, and the topic of the composition and the layers and who wrote them and who are the people behind them is a hotly debated topic. Yeah. And I think I would want to use this, even though your topic was not the compositional, your sum really takes a big part in your argument, right, and what it does to the. So if you can, we could take a step back and use this question as an opportunity to talk about this. So how would you chronologize it? Is it one person? Is it many people? Were they aware of what they were doing when they're doing changes to the earlier? So if you can address this as a more general view of what is the stam in the Talmud.
Yes, I will. And I also just see part of a question that popped up about the Greek idea of phronesis, which I didn't see the whole question, but I just want to say very much the type of moral reasoning that I just described is the Greek idea of phronesis. However, huge difference. The Greeks, we use phronesis or moral reasoning about human laws, because human laws are by definition imperfect and need to be constantly revised, but the natural law never. You would never use phronesis to revise the natural law. That's what's radical and countercultural about the rabbis. They take this idea of phronesis and they apply it to divine law, that divine law should somehow is dynamic and require modification, revision, working, process, evolving, and that's a sign of its perfection, not a sign of its imperfection. So they flip the Greek idea on its head. It's not because it's human law that's imperfect, we have to keep working at it. It's divine law, it's perfect, which requires that we work at it, right? Okay, but the stam, the only thing I wanted to say about the stam is I just wanted to be agnostic, and I wanted to, about the question of its composition. It is, as you say, a very difficult composition, a question. I personally happen to think that the truly dialectic stam is a later orchestration of earlier materials, especially those that are at the beginning of tractates. That's where we see them at the most developed, and that's where they seem to draw together traditions from a large range of time periods and so on. So I think those tend to be probably later at the level of editing and redacting, but not every anonymous unit within the Talmud is necessarily late. There was probably some along the way, but the truly dialectical, what I call the ringmaster, that I think is late, but it doesn't matter. Because what I was trying to describe was the experience one has when one enters into the game, when one joins the play. So it doesn't matter to me who's doing it. Now, individual rabbis may not have this view. Rabbi Meir, for all I know, may have really believed he had one right answer, and that was the only right answer. I think that's unlikely because, as I said, the view of divine law that emerges from rabbinic literature as a whole is, as a whole, the way I described it. Very, very little pushback on that. So I think it tends to be a view and a perspective that most of the rabbinic class shared, right? That there are positions and one argues for them, but you can't ever be absolutely sure, even if something is good or true 99.9% of the time. But it still could be the case that individual rabbis resisted. And we do see towards the end of the Talmudic period, and I've written about this, we do seem to see we hear more voices that are a little bit uncomfortable with this, with the idea that sometimes the divine law can be not completely rational, or, that it can deviate from truth and that it can deviate from natural reality. We start to see some later rabbinic voices pushing back on that and trying to sort of apologetically erase the tracks of that. So yes, there are those individual voices. I absolutely acknowledge them, and they're there. But the overall experience one has when one enters into a sugya that is orchestrated by this anonymous voice that says, why did Rabbi Meir say that? Maybe this was his reason. Maybe that was his reason. This rabbi thinks this rabbi says that, but wouldn't this disagree with him? There's this anonymous recounting or retelling of the disputes and the debates that puts people into opposition. That's the experience I was trying to capture, because I think that experience is a practical demonstration on every page of the Talmud of the larger conception of divine law that I tried to describe as emerging from rabbinic literature as a whole. Does that help answer that question?
It does. I think
Okay.
you kind of avoided, being committed to the stems.
Yeah, no,
But
I mean,
yeah.
I said I do think the dialectic is late. I do. I think that's the hand of the redactor who's really pushing that, and who knows what individuals may have thought about the strength of their own positions. But I think that the redactor is definitely trying to instill that demonstration of epistemological humility, big fancy words for don't think you're right all the time, right? That's dangerous, and that we all have to have a certain humility. That doesn't mean we don't have convictions about what we believe, but we have to recognize that there are other legitimate possibilities that could be just as strong as ours.
I have to say that works for scholarship, modern scholarship as well. We received a few questions about Maimonides. This is not in the realm of what we do here, but if you want to say a few words about that, we received a few questions about Maimonides. Maybe one or two sentences about that before we return to the Talmud.
Yeah, I don't know what questions you received, but
for example, Esther Barazin. But Maimonides state divine law accommodates itself to state received in the guide. And we had a few more people ask, really, how does Maimonides fit in your overall picture of divine law?
Maimonides very closely approaches the Greeks and the Stoics insofar as he divinizes reason. Very famous passage, I think it's in part 2, maybe 31 of the guide, where he says there are some people who think that if you ascribe rationality to the Torah or to the laws, that you are basically saying it's human, right? And that anything divine has to be transcend reason, and that it's the irrational that is divine. And he rails against this idea. He says, this is terrible. This is an insult. If someone were to say to you that you acted irrationally, you would be offended and insulted. And it's an insult to God to say that anything could be irrational. Every single one of the 613 mitzvot, he says, has the Tamei mitzvot, right? This is not a Talmudic practice. Determining reasons for the commandments is not a Talmudic practice. The phrase does not even occur in the Talmud. It is a medieval practice when reason has been elevated to a divine status, following the Greek model, and the major philosophers of the three monotheistic traditions are competing with one another to prove that their traditions are most rational, and Maimonides was among them. Every single one of the 613 commandments has a reason. He tries to articulate them all. He groups them according to 14 different categories. All of these serve this rational purpose. All of these serve this rational purpose. And he says there's a few that I haven't been able to figure out, but I will. And if I don't, it doesn't matter. They have a rational purpose. I'm sure they do. So he's absolutely dedicated to the near divinization of reason, which I think the Talmudic rabbis avoided as a kind of idolatry. If reason is sacrosanct and the be all and end all, then that's God. Then, you know, that's putting reason in place of God. So,
wow. See, we even did Maimonides here. That's wonderful. We got a few questions asking something a little bit more for people who believe that this text is sacred, or once it was accepted and codified, it becomes a text that is formal or authoritative. We need to follow it. How does your description of what the purpose of this text influence people who see this text as something that they're committed to? Does it clash with that worldview, or can people still read your book and still feel this way about the text?
Absolutely. And I would hope that they would find it all the more empowering to do so, because let's not forget the people producing this observe the halakha. They were right. So I think it's interesting, Michal, that you started your question by saying people who view this text as sacred. So, and my question immediately is yes. And what do you mean by sacred? If you mean the Greek idea of sacred or holy, that it's fixed and immutable, well, then you got a problem. But if you mean what I think the Bible means and what the rabbis mean when they talk about something as divine, then you are talking about something which invites us in and asks us to step up and get busy, roll up our sleeves, and think morally about what justice and equity are as we attempt to apply the law every single day. So I think, and I would hope that by I think there's much to be gained by bringing the rabbinic view of the divine and the rabbinic view of the divine law out of the shadows where it has been, lying dormant, covered by many, many years of thinking about the divine law as something rigid and fixed, to bring it out and to consider the fact that maybe the divine Torah was given in order to activate us dynamically to think and live, and not simply given as a set of preset answers and prescriptions that we can sort of automatically do like robots.
Wonderful answer. Thank you for that. So we have a question that's if we already turn into a less academic and more, but actually I think I would like to hear that answer as well. We have a question from Alan J. Weisbard that asks, when you start to look at the text, when you sit down at your table, right, as a scholar, and you start to look at those texts, what are the thinkers or even scholars that influence your approach to this issue? What motivates you? What inspires you when you look at the text? Or is it the other way around? You look at the text and then you whatever comes out of it, inspire you to connect it to some thinkers. So what's the process when you compose this beautiful lecture you just gave us? What's your process? Who are the thinkers that inspire you? How do you work?
Wow. That's the question that's going to stump me. I am not sure how to answer that question. I mean, I'm not sure that we're always self-conscious or aware of the various influences or inspirations that we bring to things. if I had to describe the way I work, and this might not be true, but I hope it is, I really like to think that I make every attempt possible. I'm one of those people who reads scholarship second. It's the last thing I do. That I tend to just go swimming in the texts. I tend to just, I will sit down and read a biblical text or a law or a narrative and think, well, what happened to that? And then look up how it was translated into Aramaic by the Targums, and then look at every place in rabbinic literature that talked about that particular verse or that particular story, and what did they make of it? I did this recently with the book of Ruth. It was just so great, reading Ruth. And then I went to look at Ruth Rabbah, and I just read the entire Midrash from beginning to end. I didn't go to the scholars and say, well, what do they, because you know what, turns out they were wrong. So I just read Ruth Rabbah from beginning to end, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. They really understand Ruth in a way that I think is really unusual and different. And when I would look up the scholars, they would say, here's what the rabbis think about Ruth. And they would quote one passage from Ruth Rabbah, the one passage which is atypical of the entire Midrash, and presents her in a certain way. And I thought to myself, but they obviously didn't read the whole Midrash. They just read the part that kind of made sense to them. So I guess it's a bit of a dialectic. I really think there's no substitute for just living with the sources. They are so fertile and so rich, and a million questions pop into your head. Then I will go and look to see what other people might have said. Mostly I find I disagree with what other people have said. And that's interesting too, though, because I try to figure that out. Like, why do I see things differently? Or what has influenced people or led them to not be able to see some of the things that I think are really patently obvious or there? Why are people scared of seeing what's there? Maybe, sometimes that's what it is. People don't want the text to say what they want to say. I think we just need to get out of the way of the text and let them talk for themselves.
Good. We have another question from Stephen. There's many questions. I'm really having a hard time choosing which ones, but we have Stephen Kaur asks, can you talk about the role of precedent in the Talmud? Does the role of precedent imply a formal immutability for the halacha?
So, obviously you don't want to every day start all over again from zero, right? Why reinvent the wheel? And this is true for almost everything we do in life. So of course there's accumulated wisdom. My point is simply that nothing is ever completely beyond revision as the circumstances might require. And that's one of the reasons an okimta is so important, because the rabbis may have a very clear precedent, but if you can make a distinction, what they call a distinguishing, right? And we do this in modern law, right? If there's some way to distinguish a case from another, then you have released yourself from the tyranny of the precedent, right? So we saw that even in the two passages that I went through. Rabbi Meir prohibits and Rabbi Yochanan permits. But if I make a distinction, then I can end up with a Rabbi Meir who actually permitted all sukkah walls except for one really bizarre case that probably never happened in all of the universe. I've limited his precedent to a very remote case. So, precedents are found in all legal traditions, and legal traditions have ways of employing them when it's important to do so, but also of marginalizing them when it might be important to do that. I hope that answers that question.
Good. We have a few more questions, but I think we should stop here, because I think it's a good place to stop. And I suggest, Chris, that you stay towards the end a little bit after we're done and read all the questions and comments, because you got a lot and I didn't do them justice. And it just shows, I think, how engaging your talk was, how it was thought-provoking, and I'm grateful for all the people who wrote them down, and it really makes us feel like we're in conversation with our audience as speakers, and we're really grateful for that, and for all of you, and thinking with Chris about questions of divine law and the Talmud as representing the rabbinic view. And I'm sure you're all joining me in thanking Chris for this wonderful lecture, and thought-provoking and grand scale and bird's eye view, and seriously wonderful lecture. And I invite you to talk about to join us in next week, not next week, in 2 weeks from now. In 2 weeks from now, when we meet with Professor Shai Secunda to talk about the non-Jewish background of the Babylonian Talmud, the Persians, the Christians, all the people who lived around the Talmud, and did they have anything to do with the composition or their culture and their tradition? Did it have anything to do with the authors of the Talmud and the tradition of the Talmud? So that's the question we'll ask in 2 weeks. But we come armed with those two wonderful lectures that we started our series with. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Tad?
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Michal, for wonderful moderation, and Chris for really wonderful, great lecture. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening or afternoon.
Tad, please don't hang up yet. Let's stay online. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this, Tad. It's such a great collaboration.
Thank you very much, and have a good evening or good afternoon there in the States.
Terrific. Bye-bye.
Ciao.